Farman.
May I please call Dr. Mathieu?
I do solemnly,
I do solemnly,
sincerely and truly
declare and affirm
that the evidence I shall give
shall be the truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the truth.
I hope you haven't been waiting for too long.
No, not at all. Thank you.
Could you please give your full name?
Stephen Mathieu.
Dr. Mathieu, you have given 2 witness statements to the inquiry. They are dated, they're dated 26th of March 2024 and 20th of August 2024. And for the record, they are INQ 30472300 and INQ 30474 Dr. Mathieu, you are the president of the Intensive Care Society. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And you have been in that position since December 2022?
That's correct.
You are also a consultant in critical care at Portsmouth Hospital University Trust. Is that right?
Correct.
What is the role of the Intensive Care Society?
Thank you. So the Intensive Care Society is a charity. It was founded in 1970. It's the largest multi-professional intensive care society, certainly in the UK and across Europe. And its main purpose is effectively to be the voice and support patients' relatives, and do that through our team, so our multi-professional staff. So we do that through education, policy standards, guidelines, encouraging research, education. The society itself has 23 council members, and it has 10 professional advisory groups, which means that amongst the team, we've probably got to near 100 people that are active clinicians, multi-professionals that work throughout our country.
You say across the UK, is the society UK-wide or is it England-specific?
It is UK-wide, and thank you, that was the purpose of the supplementary appendix. We do our very best to support and to provide a voice for all nations, but clearly we do that in very close collaboration with other partner organisations, including the Welsh Intensive Care Society, Northern Ireland and Scottish Intensive Care Society.
So just for clarity, what is the role of those individual societies, given that the Intensive Care Society has a UK-wide reach?
So I think they have a very important role, but as I say, we do collaborate with them. The intent is very much for us to do that together, but I think it is important that we reflect that we are not only trying to do what we need to do for patients, relatives and our teams just in England alone, but as you allude to, there are other organisations that are important and we work closely with them.
Dr. Mathieu, we have heard earlier this morning from Professor Summers and Dr. Suntharalingam, who are obviously in the intensive care sphere. There may well be some of the issues that we will talk about today that they have covered, but so that you are aware, we will cover some of those topics perhaps a little bit more briefly, but those are the topics that I was going to ask you about. And so I will just give you a heads up that in terms of those topics, they include capacity to some degree, ICU capacity, ethical issues, the mental health and well-being of staff working in intensive care. And I'll ask you a little bit more specifically about some of the work that the Intensive Care Society did during the pandemic. So if I could start with the last of those, given that's your specific role. Just for clarity, you confirmed earlier your professional role as well as your role as president of the society. Were you also working in intensive care during the relevant period?
I was. So I have a clinical and a management role in my organisation. Throughout the pandemic period, I will have effectively worked full-time on critical care.
Were you also heavily involved with the society, although you weren't president? Were you heavily involved with many of the ongoing activities of the Society during the pandemic, during the relevant period of the pandemic.
Yeah, sorry to interrupt. That's correct. Yes, I've been a member of the Society for 8 years now.
You describe in your witness statement some of the activities of the Society during the relevant period, which included the establishment of the National Emergency Critical Care Committee. Can you explain, I think you use the acronym the NECCC, can you explain the work that was done by that committee?
Yes, so the NEC, the National Emergency Critical Care Committee, was set up at pace and set up specifically to for us to understand and support our plans, our understanding, our engagement, our interactions with all the other professional teams, the other disciplines. So it was set up by Professor Hugh Montgomery and Dr. Ganesh Sundaralingam, who is one of the expert witnesses. And it was done very quickly, and it was, I suppose, unique in the sense that it was done intentionally to try and for us to understand it as much as we could quickly about the SARS-2 virus, COVID-19, but also to understand learning from other organisations and other countries, particularly Italy, at that point in time that had just had quite a significant impact from COVID. It was a very different type of committee in that it was very much bottom-up. It was non-hierarchical. It was very much an open invite to those that were able or felt they could offer some support, guidance. So we opened it up to all of our council members, the operating delivery network leads throughout the country. We opened it up to other societies. So actually what we also did, which I think was the benefit and the power of it, was opening it up to emergency medicine, acute medicine, the British Thoracic Society, the Renal Association. So suddenly we had a lot more granular detail about what their experiences were and how we could support each other.
So, sorry, just for clarity, was this a series of virtual meetings that were taking place?
Yeah, so it was set up, as I say, at pace with, in the end, there were about 30 virtual meetings. There were no face-to-face meetings. They were all done virtually. And there were also knowledge-sharing webinars. So actually, by doing that, we were able to extend our reach to around 100 organisations.
And did those organisations include government agencies or government departments?
So they included the presidents of the societies of Wales, Northern Ireland and Scotland Critical Care. And they included some of the medical directors of NHSE. But they also included lots of other important people through military. We had all sorts of invites that actually were helpful to get their understanding, the likes of Google, Microsoft, lots of different ideas to try and generate as much information as we could about data, how we could share it, how we could use it, really as a bit of a hive of understanding and knowledge dissemination.
So just for the inquiry's understanding, was the committee more concentrated on information sharing and supporting members, or was it involved actually in shaping any policy in relation to intensive care?
I think the intent was to do both, and if I may, I'll perhaps give some examples. So the context to some of this in terms of feeding information through was that the Intensive Care Society set up a national leads WhatsApp group very quickly. That was the sort of trying to get an understanding what people were feeling at a unit-by-unit level, bringing those experiences and information into NEC to see whether there was that sort of information was something that others were experiencing, and then try to address what the problem was and help with some solutions. So in terms of the guidance, the statements, the policy side of things, one example is we knew that, for instance, that there was a risk around whether there would be enough dialysis machines. I think in the end, we were able to provide enough options for renal replacement therapy, but at the time, we weren't sure. So what we were able to do is work very quickly and agilely with other organisations. I think probably removing some of the bureaucracy that can be associated with committees and associations and how you want to navigate some of this guidance documents by getting straight to the experts and getting the guidance out very quickly. So I guess that was one example. The treatment decision support guidance framework that has been discussed, that was also discussed at NEC meetings.
So if I could just, pause you there for a second. I suppose you're giving examples of where there were discussions that ultimately then led to the production of relevant guidance, albeit not necessarily a direct cause and effect, but
yes.
Is that correct? There were discussions about the relevant issues with professionals within the sphere, and some of these points were then taken on and produced in a more formal way. Is that right?
Yes, I think the intent was always for somebody with the expert knowledge and access to the right people would be the person that would take responsibility for those actions. And research is obviously a big part of that as well, as trying to make sure we were asking the right questions and using our directors of research through the Intensive Care Society to help us with that.
Within your witness statement, you have set out a number of recommendations for Her Ladyship to consider in the context of recommendations around intensive care. One of them is about the Society having a voice. This is for your reference. It's recommendation Q at the second last paragraph of your witness statement. And you refer to the Society having a voice at the relevant fora, informing national policy and decision-making for acute and intensive care, both in peacetime and during national emergencies. Do I take it from that you didn't feel that the Society did have the voice that it should have had during the relevant period?
Our view, we are a charity. We're not a Royal College or obviously part of the Academy of Royal Colleges. So therefore, I suppose our accessibility directly to high-level sort of ministers is different to the experiences that those organisations will have. I think we have an important place in those discussions, and we do have those discussions, but they are often a little bit more difficult to navigate. And I think the strength of our place, and I think it was demonstrated through NEC, was that we are genuinely a very multi-professional organisation. We are not doctors, we're not nurses, we're not physiotherapists, we're not pharmacists, we're not the other HPs that are important, the psychologists we talked about. We represent all of them, and that's where I think we have the benefit of being able to provide that different way of thinking, and therefore our ability, I think, to extend our reach into those professions and to get their views is an important one.
And do you think there's anything in the fact that you're a charity rather than perhaps a body that might otherwise be seen to be more part of, to use a colloquial term, the establishment or something to that effect, the fact that you have charitable status and you're not embedded within the institutions, does that have any relevance here?
I don't necessarily think so, and I would want to point out that I think the other organisations have an important role to play, and we are strategic partners with many of those organisations. I guess if the ask, which is the recommendation, is that it would be helpful, and I think we would genuinely be able to provide a positive and supportive influence, particularly around learning and genuine multi-professional representation, we would have a helpful place.
Can I turn to another topic, which is something which we did cover to a great degree earlier on this morning, which is that of intensive care capacity. If I could just ask you a few questions about this area. One of these is in relation to the way in which you measure intensive care capacity, and we heard about the fact that it can be measured and was indeed measured in different ways. You say in your witness statement that on the 3rd of January 2021, this is at paragraph 129, that the Society issued a document advising all hospitals to use the percentage change from baseline as a reporting figure. Do you recall why it was the Society felt it was necessary to issue that statement?
I do, thank you. So there was a variation in the way that data was being recorded, and that was leading to confusion, not intended, but it was leading to confusion, and the data that was therefore being declared and discussed at a sort of media level, public level, was sometimes inaccurate, not intentionally, but that was the result of it. So if I could give an example, if we had a 20-bedded intensive care unit, we have a physical capacity of 20 beds. If all of those beds are filled with unwell patients, we have a occupancy versus our baseline capacity of 100%. The problem happened is that everyone at the early phase of the pandemic was asked to see where there were opportunities to expand their intensive care bed spaces, and we did that, and I think we did that very well. But the risk that then happened is that those beds that were not intensive care beds, they were pop-up ICUs with different staffing ratios, with access that was different to some of the equipment that we've discussed already, meant that as a result of that, it looked like there was more available ICU bed capacity than there was. So if I use that same example, if we create another 20 beds in another part of the hospital and perhaps use a theatre recovery as an example, if 10 of those beds are full, you don't then have 75% occupancy, you've got 100 plus 50 or 150%, however you want to describe it. But it just meant that what it looked like was that there were many empty beds available across the UK, which there absolutely were not. So it's about descriptions, it's about definitions. It wasn't in any way, I don't think, intended to cause confusion, but that was the result of it. And it's recorded differently, I think, in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, as opposed to how it was very early on in the pandemic in England.
Why is it so important on a practical level to understand the real terms capacity across ICUs across the country?
So I think why it's important is that we know that when we are at or near capacity, and certainly if we are over capacity, that will have an impact. The impact being the ability to admit patients in a more timely fashion, the ability for staff to stretch to meet those demands because they're already stretched. It also has an impact on decision-making around mutual aid transfers, for an example. So that is one element of a wider group of tools, I guess, we use to describe pressure on intensive care unit, occupancy and capacity, CRITCON, which we've talked about already. And then, if I may, the other bit that none of this describes is all of the activity that was happening outside of what would be an expanded intensive care or critical care footprint. So none of this data captured all of the work that was being done and all the patients that were being cared for on respiratory high care support units, in acute medical wards. And that's why I think the definitions are so key here, that we really do capture the amount of work and effort, the amount of people, because there's a risk of talking about beds and capacity, people that we are desperately trying to do our best for.
Can I take it from what you've said then that you would support there being a nationally agreed definition of capacity to be used both in non-pandemic and in pandemic times?
Yes, and that was very much the reason that we issued our statement and made it public, in the hope that that would be captured, and it did. I think it did influence change. We saw some of the data being better recorded. I've seen firsthand within my own region the way we capture data now is much more advanced and accurate compared to where it used to be.
One of the measures that was used to try to increase capacity was the introduction of Nightingale hospitals. You touched on that very briefly within your statement, but I want to just ask you, do you consider that the role of Nightingale hospitals and the use of them was an appropriate way to try to increase intensive care capacity?
I think the intent was right in that the data very early on in the pandemic, as we were looking at various scenarios, which obviously at that point we didn't have the vaccine, we were still trying to understand a multi-system pathogen that affects all organs. We were trying to better understand what our therapeutic options were, but all of the scenarios were showing that we just would not have enough physical capacity, never mind about staffing or equipment. So I can understand the rationale for looking at it and exploring it. I think the reality, as we all then understood, is that intensive care is so reliant on a team, a multi-professional team, that need to be in the same place. We need the access to the diagnostics, the other important specialists to provide us with their input. And I think with all the best intent, the Nightingale hospitals were not going to be able to do that reliably for intensive care. It might work in some places, for instance in London in terms of decompressing, but the reality is I don't think it will have worked in the way that it was intended to, and in some ways probably was a unintended distraction in terms of us trying to consolidate and manage the workforce that we had within our own hospitals.
Taking up that point, Doctor, given that the staff you had was stretched beyond capacity,
Yes.
some might argue, and you could only open a Nightingale hospital if you had the staff, the intent may have been good, but the intent was physical beds. How is anybody ever going to staff a Nightingale hospital given the pressures on all of you working already at full stretch?
Yes, I think you've probably eloquently described it in a better way than I have. I think it's exactly that, which is you can, space is one thing, equipment is one thing, but the staff is fixed. And intensive care staff, many of the other specialty staffs, we can't just generate them quickly. They take years and years of training, and those staff were not available. So all of these things that we talk about in terms of stretching the staffing models are all reliant on the existing staff working harder, more shifts, all of those things with the impact that created. So moving them to another hospital not only meant it was the same staff doing that, but actually made you less resilient within your own organisations.
I don't know whether you're able to answer this, but do you think that maybe there is a role for a temporary hospital in circumstances where you need to increase capacity, but that's not necessarily in the context of intensive care?
Yes, and I think that's probably, I think the first thing is that now, in the situation we're at the moment, I think it's something we have to explore, which is what would we do and what would we use it for if we were to ask that same question again. And I think the answer is right, that it wouldn't be used for intensive care. The question is, could it be used for other lower acuity level care, providing it's got the right staff mix there available to look after those patients, or as a form of rehabilitation post-acute illness. But I think we do need to understand what the benefits would be in the future and the impact, particularly around the staffing models.
The Society produced a report in January 2021 called Recovery and Restitution of Critical Care. I want to have a look at a passage that was in that report. It's INQ 30395-297, and it's the third page. And if we could just look at the this text here that's been enlarged, and if you look at about 4 sentences down, there's a sentence that starts, bed occupancy was thus greater. On 24 January 2021, 5,446 English ICU beds were occupied compared to 3,423 in January 2020. And then it describes the difference there. And it goes on to at the bottom, the final sentence, which says that UK-wide in January 2021, 2,251 intensive care beds were occupied above baseline capacity, equivalent to 141 new 16-bedded ICUs. We looked briefly at this earlier today, but if we come away from this text and look at the box below, there you've then mapped these onto the recommended guidelines for the provision of intensive care services. These guidelines, just to be clear, we've heard a lot about staffing ratios, nurses, trained ICU nurses 1-to-1 being the ideal ratio, and is it 1-to-8 for consultants, or is it 1-to-12?
I think it's 1-to-8 to 12.
1-to-8 to 12.
Yes.
Okay, that's helpful. So you've then set out here all of the additional staff that would be needed to ensure that ratios weren't stretched at the point that we were in January 2021. Have I understood that correctly?
That's correct, yes.
So we can see there's a huge amount of additional staff that would be needed, including up to almost 2,500 critical care nurses in order to maintain ratios. You would accept, wouldn't you not, that in January 2021, which was we've seen data to suggest that was the peak of the pandemic and the highest point in terms of occupancy of ICU. Can I just clarify, you aren't suggesting that all of these additional staff actually need to be recruited to account for that scenario, are you?
So in order for us to be able to deliver the pandemic level of care in terms of the GPIC standards of the ratios that we recommend, those additional staff would be required. And it's worth just pointing out that that's for every 12-hour shift. So it's double those numbers for a 24-hour period. Yeah, and just to give a sense of what that is, for one critical care nurse for us to have one critical care nurse looking after a level 3 patient on intensive care 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, you would need about 5 to 6 whole-time equivalent critical care nurses to cover that.
Given that this is the amount of staff that would be needed at a peak of a pandemic, do you accept that during peaks of pandemics, if we had a pandemic that stretched ICU capacity to the same degree or in fact greater than was the case in January 2021, do you accept that it's necessary to allow staffing ratios to be stretched in that scenario?
So I think we have to accept that that's the best that we could provide in terms of stretching the staffing ratios because the staff that were needed are simply not there. So one of the lessons around that is how we can be better prepared for the future. The corollary of that is that we do stretch the staffing ratios. We know that that's not the recommendations. The recommendations are based on what is the right staffing ratios to keep patients safe. So we know that there is an impact from us doing that, both in terms of the patient quality care that we can deliver, but also the impact on the staff themselves. There are other repercussions of stretching the staffing ratios, which is the only way that we can try and improve the number of practitioners, improve the quality of care, is to redeploy staff from other areas, with the collateral damage of those decisions being that will impact on the services that they would usually provide for, and we've seen that through the delays in planned surgery, and that truly is one of the collateral damages of the COVID pandemic.
That can come down, that document. But can I ask you about that, following up on what you said about the need to redeploy staff from other areas? From the intensive care perspective, professionals working routinely in intensive care, what was the impact of having to work with staff that weren't ordinarily trained in intensive care?
So my experience of it was that everyone wanted to do the absolute best they could do. That feeling was just palpable throughout my organisation and all of the other units that I have sort of discussed with through colleagues. Everyone wanted to help. So that was the first thing to say, is whilst some colleagues were not necessarily wanting to or felt comfortable within their skill mixes to support intensive care, they absolutely stepped up and did more than we could possibly ever ask of them, and we will be very grateful forever for that. In terms of what it meant that the existing critical care staff took on a very supervisory role, as well as supporting direct patient care, which creates its own pressures and it creates its own psychological impact on them, as well as obviously those that have come into a new environment with lots of skills, but different skills, to do their very best as well.
Looking forward, were we to need to redeploy staff to intensive care in another scenario, would you support a programme perhaps of staff who routinely don't work in intensive care receiving training on intensive care skills, or in fact perhaps working a shift in intensive care every so often? That may not be practical, but do either of those two options offer suitable ways of improving the workforce should we need to rely on redeployment?
I think so, and I think it is an important recommendation, because the reality is we can't plan to staff intensive care for a pandemic every single day. But what we can do is we can make incremental steps that get us closer to what we need to when that happens again, and anything we can do to reduce that gap in terms of numbers and knowledge base are key. So you will have heard yesterday about enhanced care beds, level 1 beds, which are effectively somewhere between a ward-based level of care and a level 2 care bed on critical care. And I think that probably does give us opportunities to do some rotational programs that enable people to get exposure to critical care. I would say I don't think that in itself is enough. There is still a gap to be bridged in terms of intensive care capacity.
And does it follow that, based on the difficulties for staff who didn't ordinarily work in intensive care, in terms of it perhaps being a little bit traumatic for them, in terms of not being used to seeing very, very severely ill patients and often patients dying, does it follow that any training should include support around the impact of seeing those patients?
Yes, yeah, thank you. So it does, and I think one of the benefits we saw from Kevin Fong's testimony was around peer review support, and I think that was a very powerful way of understanding what was happening at a unit by unit level and hearing what the staff were saying and what the relatives were saying. I think as part of that has to be psychological support as well. It's something I can expand on if helpful, but that there has been work that the Intensive Care Society has done to, I think, probably dovetail quite well with what Professor Fong discussed in terms of psychological support.
Dr. Sundaralingam was talking earlier this morning about the prioritization guidance that he was working on, and he explained that the Intensive Care Society ultimately published an updated version of a draft that he had worked on initially. I don't need to take you through the guidance, but one of the comments he made was about the reassurance that guidance such as this, albeit hopefully never used, may provide for staff. Is that a view that you and the Society would endorse?
Yes, we do. I think it's the decision support framework and ensuring that it was very much related, dependent on CRITCON status and the use of mutual aid transfers is really important, and it's important for a platform for us to have a more society discussion around these things, but it's also really important for the staff to know that what they are doing is the best that they can provide, and that they know that if they are under immense pressure, there is a mechanism to enable them to be supported, and that's through QuickCom status, decision support frameworks, and also the sort of triggered peer support visits that we've discussed.
I understand that the document that was published by the Intensive Care Society, which we looked at briefly earlier, was obviously developed and issued in the context of the COVID-19 emergency. Would you support the development of a tool that could be adapted to different emergencies, produced perhaps not in the midst of an emergency, but now, or now that we're not in the emergency phase of the pandemic?
I would, yes. We made the decision that that whilst that decision support framework was not needed, that actually it was a really important guideline that needed to be in the public domain, which is why we have published in our journal, which is peer-reviewed, an academic journal, because actually one of the lessons we have to learn from this is that the discussions that we need to have around being genuinely overwhelmed, where we have got national decompensation and inadequate resources, that we have all of the right tools, all of the right discussions, we've engaged with all of the right people, and that is society, around what is the right thing to do in those situations, and hope that we never will need them, but that's not a reason not to have the discussion.
Can I ask you about a different topic that you've discussed in your witness statement, and that is oxygen? And you describe particular challenges that were caused by oxygen supply during the pandemic. And you describe particularly the impact of supply pipes having automatic cut-offs. Are you able to give us a sense of how widespread this issue was?
So I think what we have always thought is that oxygen would be an endless supply in a hospital, that there would be no limitation of oxygen supply. And I think there was a really important lesson in this pandemic, which I don't think we necessarily realised or learnt back in 2009 with the H1N1 pandemic, which is the way a hospital is designed means that there can be a plentiful supply of oxygen, but it is deliberately designed in a way that it is used for the purpose that it's intended to be used for. So if you've got a critical care unit, the diameters of those pipes, the flow, the pressure of those pipes is manufactured differently to other areas of the hospitals where you might not need as high volume of oxygen, which is why that the theatre recovery areas and the theatre environments were the ones that were generally used much more frequently than other areas for surge capacity intensive care, because they're also designed to have an oxygen-rich provision. So what we have learnt from that is that I think we spent a lot of time trying to understand the schematics of a hospital, the flow, the pressure differences, which actually, if we understood them correctly beforehand, would enable us to have really decided very quickly early on which were the best places to look after patients. So it wasn't necessarily a case of we couldn't provide the oxygen in the hospital, it was trying to find the right location to look after patients that were needing different levels of oxygen.
So is it an issue with the nature of the hospital estate rather than the supply?
Yeah, so I think initially there was concern that we wouldn't have enough oxygen supply delivered through BOC. That wasn't an issue. There was enough oxygen. It was purely the estates, and some of the hospitals, the designs clearly are very, very old, which mean that they were designed for different purposes or different reasons at those time points. So it was about identifying where the right places were to look after the patients, being really cognizant of the fact that where we wanted to look after the patients might not necessarily be the best location in terms of oxygen provision, and we'd have to adapt that, and also for cohorting patients and working out what the right balance was in terms of the cohorting of patients, the proximity to an intensive care environment, and what would be the best care, of course, for the patient.
Beyond building new hospitals, what are the best ways to ensure that these issues don't arise again?
So I think there's some really quite simple measures in here, which is to understand and to ensure that every hospital understands the schematics of their environment. And that's something that can be done, to work alongside our colleagues in clinical engineering, to work alongside our oxygen committee, which is often led by a clinical pharmacist, and to basically do a review of all of those things in a hospital, to understand what the schematics are first and foremost, and then design what you might do differently, if at all. It might be that we made all the correct decisions, but actually what we would do differently faced with another pandemic that required patients to need more oxygen than they would during our baseline level of acuity.
On a related note, is it right that one of the ways in which patient oxygen concerns are managed is, including within intensive care, is with the use of pulse oximeters?
So a pulse oximeter is a very readily available piece of equipment, effectively a peg that usually goes on the finger or an ear, and patients will also use them at home to monitor their oxygens for certain chronic conditions. It is readily available, and we use it as a marker to understand what the oxygen levels might be in the bloodstream, but doing it in a non-invasive way, which allows us then to titrate oxygen accordingly.
On the 22nd of June 2021, the Society issued a statement entitled Pulse Oximetry and Ethnicity, The Time to Act is Now. We can have a look at it. It's INQ 303952999. If we have a look at the problem, it says here 30 years ago it was recognised that SpO2 measurements were less accurate when pulse oximeters were used in patients with darker skin pigmentation, and research in the 2000s confirmed this. If this is right, why did the Society need to issue a statement in 2021 to this effect?
So I think, as you say, this has been known for quite some years, and there are still ongoing studies looking at exactly this problem. I think we felt it was important, because of our reliance on pulse oximetry, that we were really cascading it for awareness, but also, well, I was going to say indirectly, but actually I mean directly, to actually put some pressure on industry to actually make equipment that is useful and is calibrated for all of our populations. And I know some of the manufacturers are doing a lot of work in this area, but this is a really important basic level piece of equipment that we use all of the time, and therefore it's absolutely essential that it can be used for all of the patients that we look after.
So is it about manufacturing and testing products prior to them coming into force that don't risk inaccurately assessing a person's oxygen saturation levels?
I think so. I think it's part of the review process before any product is licensed, that every opportunity has been taken to ensure that it is calibrated, validated in a way that is meaningful to the patients that we are caring for.
Dr. Matthew, you have been very helpful, and you've explained a number of points within the questions that I've asked you. So those are the questions that I have to ask you. I'm going to just ask you now whether you have any particular recommendations that you would like to point out at this stage that we haven't already spoken about.
Thank you. So I think probably the key recommendation, or the key recommendations, if I may, are around workforce. I think there's two elements of that. One is around looking at opportunities to bridge the gaps in our existing workforce. We know that we came into the pandemic with not enough staff to look after the sickest patients that we care for in hospital. So there's that element to it. I think the bit that is probably the more urgent and pressing matter is retention of staff. The pandemic has really harmed people. It's, we've talked about well-being and psychological support and moral distress. It's the number of staff that have left because of what is basically embedded scars because of the pandemic, trying to do their very best, is something we have to learn from, and we have to support them, and whatever psychological support we can provide and learning opportunities is key. I think the oxygen schematics one we talked about is what I've described as a relatively quick win, in that we can plan better for the future with no additional resource by doing that.
Thank you very much. Those are my questions.
Can I go back to the pulse oximeters, Dr. Matthew, please? It seems extraordinary that over 30 years ago, people could have recognised that those who had a darker coloured skin might have their lives put at risk because these pieces of equipment weren't measuring the oxygen in their blood. Whose fault is it that nothing has happened? Is it the manufacturers? Is it regulators? Is it those who buy the manufacturers' products who aren't putting... Where's it going wrong? Because it's seriously wrong, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm making an assumption that this is resolvable. I find it frustrating that we have a product that is so important that doesn't provide the same reliability of data or evidence that we need for all of our populations. I think the question of the manufacturers and those that validate those pieces of equipment and allow them to go onto the public market is this the very best we can do? And if the answer is no, then we shouldn't be validating it and allowing it to be used, and we should be pushing industry to find solutions. What I would say is a lot of the I understand the manufacturers have looked at lots of different algorithms to try and resolve it to some success, but not complete success. So what I would say, just if I may, just for assurance for patients who we would be caring for in a hospital environment, is one element of physiology that we look at. There are many others that which would tell us, give us some idea of whether the oxygen levels were lower than that were being seen or recorded, including wakefulness, cognition, other elements of organ or body dysfunction. And we also have access to doing more invasive blood tests, but of course we don't want to do those if we can avoid doing them, because whilst they will give us more reliable data, actually we don't want to do unnecessary blood tests on people if we can avoid it. And
presumably intensive care specialists would be trained and know of the problems with pulse oximeters if you have a darker or black or brown skin.
Yes. It is well understood, but part of the reason we wanted to put that statement out was just as another reminder, really.
It's just the NHS must have huge buying power. See, you might have thought...
Yeah.
Oh, well, we don't have... You're not a manufacturer, so maybe I need to pursue it with someone else, but I do find it extraordinary. You haven't solved that problem. No. Right, Mr. Jacobs.
My lady, in fact, the question I was going to ask has been amply covered, so I shan't cover the same ground. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Weatherby.
Now, I'm going to ask you a few questions, Doctor, on behalf of the COVID-bereaved Families for Justice United Kingdom. And I want to pick up just a couple of points on staffing and capacity, which I know you've been asked a lot about. We've heard a lot of evidence about. And I want to preface them by making clear that I'm not criticising the massive efforts that were made by yourself and staff in intensive care units to fill the gaps, not least because some of the families that I represent are the families of healthcare workers that actually died. But the starting point, as I think you said only a moment ago, is that you started the pandemic. We came into the pandemic where already business as usual, ICU staffing was under strain. It was understaffed. Yes.
Yes.
And at paragraph 128 of your statement, you say that ICUs were very quickly at or over capacity. So those are the two sort of starting points, if you like. And it's right, isn't it, that during the course of the pandemic, in March 2021, the Society produced a consensus statement entitled Levels of Adult Critical Care, which was a consensus statement because it was agreed by a number of other groups, including the faculty, the RCN, the British Association of Critical Care Nurses, and etc. And one of the things that the consensus statement said, made clear, was that probably the biggest contributing factor to the delivery of care in intensive care is staffing. Now, that might seem a very obvious statement to make, but you felt the necessity of reinforcing that. And am I right that the Society reinforced that point because it's the quality of staffing, or the level of training of staffing rather than quality, that is a key part of the staffing issues?
You're absolutely correct.
Yep.
There's the staffing in terms of the numbers of trained staff.
Yeah.
There's also the experience of those trained staff. It takes many years to train a specialist in critical care. It takes even more years for them to become those really, really experienced, high-level performing staff that we are all accustomed to working with. That's the risk of recruitment problems at this stage.
So in March 2021, here you are reinforcing the point that although you've managed to draft in many other staff who did their absolute level best, a key problem was that even where you had the numbers, they weren't the sufficiently trained staff. So there's only so much they could add.
So that's correct. The way that many intensive care units would have done their very best to manage that would have been to bring those staff that were, I suppose, most familiar with intensive care, whether they'd had previous background intensive care training and had gone off to do other specialist work, including community nursing as well. Research, obviously the impact of that is that meant that some of the research work that needed to be done might get delayed. So obviously we would try and redeploy the staff that were most capable and able and willing to
You'd be as smart as possible in the way that you redeployed.
Correct.
But the consensus statement went on and expressly stated that although things had to be done that way, the staffing ratios that had been recommended in peacetime should remain as they are until or unless there was further evidence about them. That's right, isn't it? So what the consensus statement said was the GPIC's addition to recommendations. Now, that's the guidelines for the provision of intensive care services that the faculty and yourselves put out, just for the record, INQ 000361989. So during the pandemic, although you'd had this workaround as best as you possibly could, you were underlining that shouldn't become the new norm, and that the recommendations that had been made before the pandemic should remain in place. That's right, isn't it?
That's absolutely correct.
Yeah.
The point being that those standards are the best evidence that we have for a safe staffing model at present, and whilst we have to or had to stretch that staffing ratio to enable us to care for the number of patients that we needed to look after, what we couldn't do and shouldn't do is reset those standards as business as usual.
Yeah. And the worry was that if those standards slipped without evidence to the contrary, but unless they were kept, then the problem was that there would be a negative impact on patient outcomes. That's right, isn't it?
Yes, I think that's absolutely right. The staffing levels, the staffing ratios are embedded within the guidelines for provisions of intensive care services for that exact reason, which is safe staffing models. Yeah,
we don't need to go to the GPICS guidance from 2019, but I do want to just read out one sentence from it, if I can find it, which is at page 32 of it. And it's this: "It is widely acknowledged that the intensive care workforce is costly. However, previous attempts to reconfigure this workforce in order to reduce staffing budgets have resulted in negative patient outcomes." So that's pre-pandemic. So during the pandemic, the Society puts out this consensus statement indicating that so far as is possible, we have to keep to the recommended levels. Otherwise, patient outcomes will be negatively impacted. That's right.
So that's correct, and the only way of managing to keep to those staffing levels was for the existing staff to do more. And that's indeed exactly what they did do.
And because you simply didn't have the sufficiency of staff, then that would inevitably have led to a negative impact.
Correct. I'm in agreement. The staffing levels are there for a purpose, which is that we know that those are the safest staffing levels that we require to look after acutely unwell patients.
And in fact, there is ICNARC data showing that there were higher acute hospital mortality rates where there was a higher capacity strain on ICUs.
That's correct.
Yes. Now, quickly moving on, changing the subject to older people. The Society's clinical guidance about critical care and COVID, again, I'll give the reference, we don't need to put it up, INQ 000395282, and it's at page 5. That clinical guidance that the ICS put out makes clear, and I quote, "Each patient will continue to be considered as an individual," and quote, "Comprehensive individualised assessments will be used," and that short of reaching a CRITCON 4 that we discussed earlier today, that other approaches should not be used for individualised decision making. Is that a fair summary of the guidance that was put out?
It is, yeah. I mean, it's absolutely clear, as you say, that the guidance is only to be used in the context of national decompensation at CRITCON level 4, with some decision support frameworks and ethical guidance that surrounds that, yes.
Now, I think you've seen the research that was done for the inquiry, the IFF research on escalation of care. I do want to show you this bit. We looked at it briefly with the experts this morning, but there's one more page I just want to put to you for your comment. And I think it's available. It's INQ 000499523, and it's page 24. Have we got that? Yeah, so on the left-hand side, we've got instructions from employers, and this is a survey of healthcare professionals. And during each wave of the pandemic, 1 in 3 HCPs said they received instructions from their employer on which groups should not be escalated to the next level of care. So that's a huge proportion. Yes? And then on the right-hand side, just the bits that you'll be most concerned about, is that within that figure, 28% of critical care nurses and 17% of critical care doctors.
Microphone, Mr. Weatherby. Sorry, because you're leaning down, sorry.
I'm so sorry. It's 28% of critical care nurses and 17% of critical care doctors were included in those figures. Would you agree that doesn't really fit with the guidance in terms of individualised assessments? It rather indicates that there were instructions on blanket criteria.
So that's exactly what this data suggests. And I have reviewed the survey. I genuinely cannot understand those responses because
Right.
I am not aware of any employer within an intensive care environment being given instructions on who should be escalated. That is a clinical decision.
All right. Well, I shan't ask you anything more about that data then, but obviously it's there. Just one more point on this, that we heard earlier today of research which shows that admissions to ICUs in March and early April of 2020, the average age of admissions went down. And again, there's a lack of evidence as to why that was, as I understood the evidence earlier. Are you able to comment on that?
So I listened to Professor Rowan's response to that, and I think I will probably come to the same conclusion, which is I don't know why the data is different. I think there are probably a number of reasons, which include vaccination, therapeutic strategies available being different. During the second wave, there was a real...
Can I just stop you there, just on that point? Sorry to interrupt you, but we are here talking about data from late March, early April 2020.
Oh, apologies.
Yeah.
I'm afraid I can't give you an answer to that question.
Okay, all right, I shan't pursue that further. But it's disturbing, isn't it, that there are these reports and there is this data which does paint a picture of the admissions not being in accordance with the clinical guidance, the individualised clinical guidance. I'm sorry, I can't comment on that. Fair enough.
I don't think the guideline or the guidance is different to what is current practice for intensive care, which is very much around those staffing ratios should be protected, unless we are in a position where we have local pressure, to regional, to national pressure, or with the option to try and decompress through using our workforce differently internally. I don't mean redeploying staff, but moving people away from other important ICU roles to ensure that we protect the direct clinical care, but also with that mutual aid transfer option.
I shan't pursue it any further. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Weatherby. Ms. Woodward. Behind the pillar, Doctor.
Thank you.
Thank you, Doctor. I asked questions on behalf of COVID bereaved Families for Justice Cymru. And my first question is about the draft guidance published from the Intensive Care Society for use as a decision support tool, which we've heard quite a lot about now. And you said during your evidence earlier today that guidance was very related to CRITCON status. My question is that given that CRITCON was not formally adopted in Wales, how is it intended that the guidance would be used in Wales?
So I think, thank you. I think CRITCON is, as you rightly point out, is not universally used in Wales or indeed Scotland and Northern Ireland. It very much is used within England. I think the size, the organisational structures of Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland are different, and different in the way that the connectivity to to higher levels of decision making at sort of CMO level is probably more direct than it is in England, and that's not meant to be that's a comment rather than a point of view. They're just different types of structures. So what I do know is that there are the way that pressure is discussed and concerns raised will still be to the parliamentarians, the main decision makers, but not necessarily using CritCon as that way of describing it. I think CritCon would be a really helpful tool to be used across all devolved nations, because actually what it would do is give us just one simple language that we could then use to enable us when we are at a point of national, if we were at a point of national decompensation, to use that scoring, that description of pressure and the action associated, which may include transfers outside of regional boundaries, to be used.
Thank you. My next question is about data collection and access, and you address this at paragraph 75 of your witness statement. And you state that the absence of centrally held data for COVID-19 patients made it difficult to obtain, compare and analyse data being recorded. And you highlight in that paragraph the differences between England and Scotland and the way they hold data. What was the position regarding data collection in Wales, to your knowledge?
So I'm afraid I don't have a detailed answer to that, but what I can say is that the way, so Wales will capture data in a similar way to the other nations. I think where we are perhaps different across nations and including within regions in England is the descriptions, the definitions that we use, and that's the point very much I was making around occupancy and capacity and surge capacity. And we do need to try and come up with a common terminology that means that actually when we do review the data, to try and get a much more of a UK understanding of where we are, that actually we're using the same descriptions.
And as you said, Doctor, there, you spoke earlier about the difficulties in talking about capacity because of the way the data was collected. Were there any other barriers or deficiencies in respect of effective data collection, analysis or sharing between the four nations that you were aware of outside of the capacity issue?
No, not that I'm aware of, and I think probably, if I may, just to try and describe a positive around data capture is obviously the data needs to be anonymised, and that obviously important. And whatever we do around data collection, we need to be clear that we are sticking to the standards that we would expect of that data capture. But the reality of it is that what we did, and I think did really well across all nations, was knowledge share, understand, use data, work out what it was telling us, direct the research activity that we needed to be directed towards, and try to use that common language as best we could to describe the best treatment strategies that we could. So I think the data is there, and the data is enriched by having as many nations involved in sharing that information. I guess what would be helpful for the future is to be able to access it through a single portal.
Thank you, Doctor. My next question is about staff wellbeing, which you've addressed at paragraph 94 of your witness statement, where you look at the impact of the pandemic on the Society's members, patients and their families. And in there you identify the many challenges faced by staff, including lack of beds, lack of experienced and trained intensive care staff, a lack of PPE, and concerns about staff protecting themselves and their own families at home. My question is whether staff, from your knowledge, were also concerned about the absence of routine patient and staff testing.
I think like everyone, the view was very much that we needed to just try and conform to whatever the guideline would tell us to do. But I think equally, I think there were, concerns expressed about staff testing when it should be done. I think one of the problems we had, certainly at points of the pandemic, was the fact that lateral flow tests, for example, would remain positive for a very long period of time, even though we knew that from a viremic point of view, in terms of risk, it probably was much shorter than that. And the challenge then became, what do you do with that information when you've got staff that are incredibly stretched and staff that want to work, are available to work, but might have a positive test. So I think that's probably a different way to describing your point, and I'm sorry for doing it that way. But I guess, like everyone, we were looking at the guidelines and being consistent with how we approached it.
And were there any concerns specifically raised about absence of routine testing for patients, which is perhaps a slightly different issue to what you've just said about staff?
Yes, but probably modified by the use of PPE for aerosol generating procedures.
Thank you very much. Those are my questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms Woodward. Very grateful. That completes the questioning for you, Dr. Murchie. Thank you very much for all your work. You're on the front line, and obviously for your help in preparing your written statement, which I will consider as well as your oral evidence. So don't worry if you haven't covered something. And thank you very much for coming today.
Thank you.
I think that completes the evidence we can hear today. I do hope that the witnesses' family emergency resolves itself successfully.
So do we, and we will update your ladyship as soon as we are able. My lady, we have, all being well, a very busy timetable for tomorrow. So there's one matter I'd like to, with your permission, deal with today, and it's the statements of some additional impact evidence that we would like to invite your ladyship to publish. There are 13 statements in all at this stage to be published. And may I just indicate, without giving the INQs, just the witnesses' names and the brief outline of the topics that they cover. There is a statement from Mrs. Carla Jones-Charles, who's a member of the Trades Union Congress. She is a director of midwifery at the Walsall Healthcare NHS Trust and speaks to the impact on midwives, picking up on some of the evidence you've heard this week. The statement of Dr. David Bailey, who's a member of the BMA. He's a GP in Wales and so attests to the impact of the pandemic from his perspective. Dr. Jack Parry-Jones, who's a member of the Royal College of Anaesthetists, the Faculty of Intensive Medicine and the Association of Anaesthetists, is in fact the lead clinician for the South East Wales Critical Care Network and so speaks to the impact from his perspective in Wales. Sarah Jones, who's a member of the 13 PBPOs, suffered an ectopic pregnancy during the pandemic, and she speaks powerfully of the impact of that on her. There is the statement from M3W2, who is a nurse originally from the Philippines who worked in the NHS, who gave a statement on behalf of FMHWG. And there is a statement from Sanjeev Panesar, who is a pharmacist based in Birmingham and a member of the National Pharmacy Association that we'd like you to publish. There is a statement from M3W3, who is an ethnic minority healthcare worker who assessed patients with suspected mental health difficulties that presented themselves at A&E, that we would ask you to publish. Two statements from witnesses from Qatar, Gillian Higgins and Natalie McDermott, who speak to IPC measures. But in addition, Miss Higgins was redeployed to A&E during January 2021, and she attests to that. And indeed, Natalie McDermott, along with the other matters that she set out, worked on a COVID ward during the pandemic. She speaks to that. Claire Cole from the Johns campaign speaks about the circumstances of her father's death. And Rachel Ashton, also from the Johns campaign, was a nurse working during the pandemic, but she sadly cared for her brother who had mental health difficulties and during the pandemic died by suicide in February 2021. And there are two statements from Josh Miller and Priyanka Patel, both of whom are members of the Royal Pharmaceutical Society. Mr. Miller was based in Scotland and gives evidence from his perspective there. And Ms. Patel was a student at the start of the pandemic and so brings to bear some slightly different evidence about how the pandemic affected her, her studies and her training thereafter.
Thank you. Not only may they be published, but I wish to emphasise yet again that I'll ensure that they're all read extremely carefully and the contents considered. The oral part of these hearings is just one part. The written material is as important, and I'm just sorry that we haven't got the time to call everybody to give oral evidence. We just don't.
No,
So
thank you.
Thank you very much. Very well. 10 o'clock tomorrow, please.
All right.